I had $50 million sitting in my secret bank account, but my own children looked at me and saw nothing but a beggar. They treated my stepfather, a man who has never worked an honest day in his life, like a king, while they treated me like the help. I sat in silence while they humiliated me, while they mocked my clothes, and while they tried to erase me from their lives. They didn't know that the luxury house they were sleeping in, the loan they were terrified of, and the very ground they walked on belonged to me. At their bankruptcy hearing, I finally stood up and revealed the truth, and the look on their faces was worth every single penny. Before I tell you how I destroyed their world to save my dignity, please hit that like button and subscribe if you believe respect is earned, not bought. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. My name is Ezekiel Freeman, but to the people sitting at the best table in the Pearl, Chicago's most pretentious seafood restaurant, I was just Zeke, the embarrassing old man who smelled like the past. It was my son Tyrell's 32nd birthday. I walked into the private dining room wearing my old charcoal suit. It was clean and pressed, but the lapels were wide and the fabric was worn shiny at the elbows. I bought it 20 years ago when I was still working double shifts at the docks before my logistics patent was leased by every major shipping company in the hemisphere. I could have worn the $5,000 Tom Ford suit hanging in my cedar closet or the Patek Philippe watch sitting in my safe, but I needed to see them. I needed to see them clearly without the blinding glare of my wealth. Tyrell saw me coming and his smile died instantly. He was wearing a fitted blazer that I knew he put on a credit card. He stood up not to hug me, but to block my path to the head of the table. "Dad, you made it," he said, though his voice suggested he was hoping I would get lost in traffic. I moved toward the empty seat next to him, the place of honor for a father, but Tyrell placed a heavy hand on my chest. "Not there, Zeke," he said, dropping the title of father as if it were a heavy coat he didn't want to carry anymore. "That seat is for Bishop. He likes the view of the skyline. You can sit over there." He pointed to a small wobbly chair squeezed into the corner directly next to the swinging double doors of the kitchen. Every time a waiter walked out, I would get hit with a blast of steam and the smell of old frying oil. "Bishop is your stepfather, Tyrell," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "I am the man who raised you." Tyrell rolled his eyes, checking his reflection in a spoon. "Bishop is the man who taught me how to dream big, Zeke. You taught me how to survive. There is a difference. Now please just sit down and try not to embarrass me. Courtney's friends are here." I sat in the wobbly chair. I watched Bishop King walk in. He was 72, 2 years older than me, but he moved with the swagger of a man who believed his own con. He was wearing a velvet jacket and a gold chain that looked heavy enough to anchor a boat. He drove a rented Bentley, but he told everyone it was a lease while his investments matured. My son lit up like a child on Christmas morning when Bishop sat down. Courtney, my daughter-in-law, sat across from me. She was a woman who lived her entire life through the lens of her phone camera. She looked at my suit and then wrinkled her nose, a small, cruel gesture she didn't bother to hide. When the waiter came around with the wine list, a bottle that cost $300, he started to pour a glass for me. Courtney reached out and covered my glass with her hand. "Oh, don't waste the vintage Cabernet on Zeke," she said loudly enough for the entire table to hear. Her voice was light, airy, and laced with arsenic. "He is not used to the good stuff. His palate is more accustomed to well tap water. Just bring him a pitcher of ice water. He will be fine." The waiter froze, looking at me with pity. I felt the heat rise in my neck, not from shame, but from a simmering rage. I could buy this restaurant. I could buy the vineyard that made this wine. My driver Michael was waiting 2 blocks away in a Rolls-Royce Phantom that cost more than the mortgage on Courtney's childhood home. But I simply nodded at the waiter. "Water is fine," I said. Courtney laughed, a tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. "See?" she said to her friends. "He is so simple. It is actually kind of sad. We try to help him, but some people just prefer the struggle." I took a sip of my water. I watched them eat seafood towers and steaks, racking up a bill that I knew Tyrell could not afford. I watched Bishop tell stories about real estate deals that I knew didn't exist. He talked about a development in Dubai, a resort in Mexico, millions of dollars floating in the air like smoke. Tyrell hung on every word, his eyes wide with admiration. "That is amazing," Pop Tyrell said to Bishop. "You really have the golden touch." Bishop winked, flashing a smile that had charmed a dozen investors out of their life savings. "It is all about mindset, son," Bishop said, gesturing with a forkful of lobster. "You have to dress the part to get the part. You cannot walk around looking like a tragedy and expect to be treated like a triumph." He cast a sideways glance at me. The table erupted in polite, cruel laughter. I cut my chicken quietly. I was not there to argue. I was there to gather evidence. I was there to see if there was anything left of the son I drove to football practice, the boy I sat up with when he had a fever, the young man I sent to college with the overtime pay from my back-breaking shifts. Then came the gifts. Tyrell stood up and tapped his glass. "I want to make a toast," he said, "to the man who showed me what it means to be a success. To the man who stepped in and guided me when I needed a vision. To Bishop." He handed Bishop a small box. Bishop opened it to reveal a gold watch. It was flashy, likely bought on installment, but Bishop acted like he had just been crowned king. "Thank you, son," Bishop said, wiping a fake tear from his eye. "And because you have been such a good student, I have a little something for you." Bishop pulled a set of car keys from his pocket and tossed them onto the table. They landed with a heavy clatter next to the butter dish. "It is outside," Bishop announced. "A brand new Mercedes. The lease is in my name, but it is yours to drive. You need a car that matches your ambition." Tyrell gasped. Courtney shrieked. They hugged Bishop as if he were a savior. I looked at the keys. I knew Bishop's credit score was lower than the temperature outside. That car was likely rented for the weekend or leased under a predatory subprime loan that Tyrell would end up paying for. But to them, it was magic. Then the room went quiet. Tyrell turned his gaze to me. The contrast was intentional. He wanted to highlight the difference between the stepfather who gave him a Mercedes and the biological father who drank tap water in the corner. "Well," Zeke Tyrell said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Do you have anything for me? Or did you just come for the free meal?" Courtney giggled, covering her mouth with her napkin. I reached into the inner pocket of my worn suit jacket. I felt the envelope there. Inside was a check for $50,000. It was the down payment for the house they were renting, a gift I had planned to give him to help them start building real equity. I looked at Tyrell's arrogant face. I looked at Bishop's smug grin. I looked at Courtney's disdain. I pulled my hand out of my pocket empty. "I brought you my presents," I said calmly. "And I brought you the truth, though I don't think you are ready to unwrap that gift yet." Tyrell scoffed, turning his back on me. "Typical," he muttered. "Absolutely useless. Mom was right to leave you. You are a dead weight, Zeke." He turned back to Bishop, pouring him more wine. "Let's drink to real family," Tyrell shouted. I stood up. I didn't say a word. I placed a $20 bill on the table to cover my chicken and my water because I never owe anyone anything. I walked out past the kitchen, past the laughing table, and out into the cold Chicago night. I texted my driver. I texted my lawyer. The dinner was over, but the lesson was just beginning. And I promised myself as I stepped into the heated leather interior of my Rolls-Royce that by the time I was done with them, they would wish they had never asked me for a single thing. I did not even have time to loosen my tie before the pounding started on my front door. It was not a knock. It was a demand. I knew who it was before I even turned the deadbolt. My apartment in South Chicago was not a palace. The paint in the hallway was peeling in long, dry strips, and the radiator hissed like a cornered cat. To my son Tyrell, this place was a symbol of my failure. To me, it was a fortress. I opened the door, and Tyrell pushed past me without a word, bringing a gust of cold wind and the scent of desperation into my living room. Courtney followed him, her heels clicking loudly on the linoleum floor. She looked around with her nose wrinkled as if she had just stepped into a sewer. Tyrell paced the small room, his hands shaking. He turned to me with eyes that were wild and bloodshot. He told me I needed to sell the apartment. He did not ask. He told me. He said Bishop had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He called it a guaranteed return on a real estate development that was going to change the skyline. He needed $50,000 to buy in as a junior partner. He said Bishop was doing him a favor by letting him in at the ground level. I looked at my son. He was sweating. He was manic. He truly believed that Bishop King, a man who rented his jewelry, was going to make him a millionaire. I walked over to the small wooden table by the window. It was the same table where my late wife Sarah used to roll out dough for biscuits on Sunday mornings. Tyrell wanted me to sell the memories of his mother to fund the delusions of a con artist. I told him no. I told him this apartment was my home. I told him that Bishop King was selling smoke and mirrors. Tyrell slammed his hand on the table. The wood groaned under the impact. He shouted that I was jealous. He screamed that I was trying to hold him down because I was miserable and wanted company. He said I was a crab in a bucket pulling him back just as he was about to climb out. He looked at the faded wallpaper and the old armchair and asked me how I could choose to live like a rat when I could help him become a king. I stood there and took his insults. I let them wash over me. I did not tell him that I did not just own this apartment. I did not tell him that I owned this entire building. I did not tell him that I owned the building next door and the two across the street. I did not tell him that I lived in Unit 1B because it was on the ground floor and allowed me to keep an eye on the maintenance crew. I did not tell him that the radiator hissed because I was waiting for a part to arrive from Germany to fix the central boiler system for all my tenants. I played the role of the poor, stubborn old man because that was the only role he was willing to see. While Tyrell was screaming about his bright future, Courtney was wandering through my home like a health inspector looking for a violation. She opened my kitchen cabinets and sighed loudly when she saw the generic brand coffee. She walked into the bathroom and I heard the sound of the medicine cabinet creaking open. She had no right. She had no boundaries. She walked back into the living room holding a small orange bottle. It was my blood pressure medication, hydrochlorothiazide, a standard prescription for a man of 70. But Courtney held it up like she had found a smoking gun. She looked at Tyrell and lowered her voice to a stage whisper. She said, "Look at this, Tyrell." She said these pills can cause confusion. She said she had noticed I was repeating myself at dinner. She said I was forgetting things. She said living alone in this condition was dangerous. She looked at me with a fake sympathy that was colder than hate. She said, "Zeke, do you even remember what day it is?" I stared at her. I knew exactly what day it was. It was the day my daughter-in-law decided to weaponize my health to get her hands on a check. I knew the side effects of my medication better than she knew her own husband. But I stayed silent. I let her build her narrative. She turned to Tyrell and said it was irresponsible to let me make financial decisions when I was clearly slipping. She said I was not competent. She said I was holding on to this property out of confusion and senility, not logic. Tyrell looked at the bottle and then at me. I saw the gears turning in his head. He did not want to believe I was sick because he cared about me. He wanted to believe I was sick because it gave him an excuse to take control. If I was crazy, then my refusal to sell the apartment was not a decision. It was a symptom. He stepped closer to me. He lowered his voice, trying to sound like the reasonable adult speaking to a child. He said Mom would want him to take care of the finances. He said the market was crashing and this apartment was going to be worthless in a year. He lied to my face. He said he could sell it for me, invest the money with Bishop, and double it in 6 months. He said he would put me up in a nice place with the profits. I looked him in the eye and spoke clearly. I said I am not selling this apartment. I said I am not giving a dime to Bishop King. I said my blood pressure is fine and my mind is sharper than the knife in his pocket. The air in the room changed. The pretense of concern evaporated. Tyrell stepped back, his face twisting into a sneer. He looked at Courtney and nodded. Courtney reached into her oversized designer handbag. She pulled out a glossy brochure and a single sheet of paper filled with dense legal text. She threw them onto the table next to where my wife used to make biscuits. The brochure had a picture of smiling elderly people playing checkers under fluorescent lights. The name on the front read Shady Grove State Facility. It was not a retirement community. It was a warehouse for the forgotten. It was a state-funded storage unit for people whose families had thrown them away. Courtney tapped a manicured fingernail on the paper. She said this was the application. She said they had already spoken to a social worker. She said if I was unable to manage my assets for the benefit of the family, then I clearly could not take care of myself. She looked at me with eyes that were dead and flat. She delivered the ultimatum. She said, sign over the deed to the apartment so Tyrell can invest, or sign yourself into Shady Grove. She said they did not have room in their house for a useless burden. She said if I did not provide value, I did not get to be a part of their future. Tyrell stood beside her, crossing his arms. He did not look away. He did not flinch. He was backing her play. He was willing to put his father in a state-run facility, a place known for bed sores and neglect, just to get $50,000 for a man he barely knew. I looked at the brochure. I looked at the deed transfer document they had hidden underneath it. I felt a coldness settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the drafty window. This was not just greed. This was an eviction notice from my own family. They were telling me that my worth was measured only in what they could extract from me. I picked up the brochure. I looked at the smiling stock photo faces. I looked up at my son and his wife. I asked them if they were serious. I asked Tyrell if he was really going to throw me away for money. Tyrell looked at his watch. He said he did not have time for drama. He said Bishop needed the answer by morning. He said I had to choose. Be an investor or be an invalid. There was no third option. I placed the brochure back on the table. I smoothed it out with my hand. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply told them to get out of my house. Courtney laughed. It was a sharp barking sound. She said it was not going to be my house for much longer. She said they would call Adult Protective Services in the morning. She said they would tell them I was a danger to myself. She grabbed Tyrell's arm and pulled him toward the door. As they walked out, Tyrell turned back one last time. He said he hoped I enjoyed the cold because it was only going to get colder. He slammed the door so hard the plaster dust drifted down from the ceiling. I stood in the silence of my apartment. I listened to their footsteps fading down the hallway. I walked to the window and watched them get into their leased car. I waited until their taillights disappeared around the corner. Then I walked to my bedroom closet and moved the old shoebox on the top shelf. Behind it was a wall safe. I punched in the code. Inside was a ledger and a burner phone. I took out the phone. I dialed a number I had not used in years. It was time to stop being the father and start being the landlord. If they wanted to play games with property and eviction, I was going to teach them how the game was really played. The address on the business card led to a glass tower downtown, the kind of building that charged you just to breathe the lobby air. I walked past the security desk with the confidence of a man who actually owned the building across the street, though nobody here knew that. I was just Zeke in his old coat coming to beg for scraps. Or so they thought. I took the elevator to the 35th floor. The sign on the glass doors read King Global Enterprises in gold lettering that looked like it had been stuck on yesterday. Bishop King was sitting behind a desk that was too big for the room. He was wearing a suit that shimmered under the recessed lighting, and he was shouting into a phone talking about liquid assets and offshore holdings. When he saw me, he didn't hang up. He just pointed a manicured finger at the chair opposite him and kept talking for another 5 minutes. It was a power move, a cheap one. When he finally put the phone down, he didn't offer me a hand. He leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head, and smiled the smile of a shark that just found a wounded seal. He asked me if I had come to deliver the $50,000 personally. He asked if I had finally decided to stop holding my son back. I looked at him. I told him I was not there to invest. I told him I was there to warn him. I told him that if he took a single dime from Tyrell, I would make it my life's mission to audit every second of his existence. Bishop laughed. It was a loud, ugly sound that bounced off the glass walls. He stood up and walked around the desk, leaning against the edge so he could look down on me. He called me a washed-up dock worker. He said I smelled like grease and failure. He said men like me were jealous of men like him because we were too afraid to take what we deserved. He told me I was small. He told me I was the past. Then he leaned in close enough for me to smell the expensive scotch on his breath at 10 in the morning. He dropped the bomb. He told me I was too late to stop anything. He told me Tyrell didn't need my $50,000 anymore. He said Tyrell had already proven his loyalty. He said my son had signed a second mortgage on his house yesterday afternoon. He had cashed out all the equity he had built over 5 years and wired it directly to King Global Enterprises. I felt the blood drain from my face. That house was the only stable thing Tyrell had. It was the home where my grandchildren might have lived one day. Bishop saw my reaction and grinned. He tapped my chest with his finger. He said, Tyrell is a man of vision, Zeke. He knows you have to spend money to make money. He knows his real father is the one who can make him rich, not the one who tells him to save his pennies. I did not shove his hand away. I did not shout. I did not flip the desk. I sat perfectly still. The rage was there, hot and white in my gut, but I pushed it down. I engaged the part of my brain that had built a logistics empire from a single truck. I stopped looking at Bishop as a rival and started looking at him as a liability. I started to look at the room, really look at it. I noticed that the mahogany desk had a small tag on the side that said Property of Rent a Center. I looked at the paintings on the walls. They were generic prints you could buy at any home goods store, the price tags barely scraped off the frames. I looked at the secretary outside the glass wall. She was young, pretty, and typing furiously on a computer that I could see was not even plugged into the wall outlet. She wasn't a secretary, she was an actress. I looked at the shelves behind Bishop. They were filled with binders labeled tax returns and investor profiles. One of the binders was leaning open slightly. It was empty. There were no papers inside, just air. This wasn't a global enterprise. It was a stage set. It was a boiler room operation designed to look like a hedge fund. It was a classic Ponzi scheme built on the desperation of people like my son. Bishop wasn't investing money. He was eating it. I stood up slowly. Bishop was still smirking, waiting for me to beg or scream. I did neither. I adjusted my coat. I looked him in the eye and said nothing. I turned around and walked out. As I passed the secretary, I saw her screen reflection in the glass door. She was playing solitaire. She didn't even look up. I walked to the elevator. My heart was heavy, not with fear, but with the terrible weight of what I knew I had to do. I had to let them fall. I had to let Tyrell hit the bottom because he would never believe me if I told him the truth now. He was too far gone. My phone began to buzz before the elevator even hit the lobby. The caller ID said Tyrell. I took a breath. I slid my thumb over the screen, but I did not just answer. I tapped the small red icon in the corner of my interface. Recording started. I put the phone to my ear. I didn't even get to say hello. Tyrell's voice was a raw scream. He asked me what I had done. He said Bishop just called him. He said I had marched into his office and threatened him. He said I was trying to sabotage the biggest deal of his life out of pure spite. I tried to speak. I said, Tyrell, listen to me. He cut me off. He screamed that he was done listening. He said I was toxic. He said I was a crab in a bucket dragging everyone down into the mud with me. He told me to stay away from Bishop. He told me to stay away from his wife. He told me to stay away from his house. Then he said the words that severed the last thread holding us together. He said, you are not my father anymore. He said Bishop is my father now. He said Bishop believes in me. He said, do not call me. Do not come by. You are dead to me, Zeke. Just go back to your hole and die alone. The line went dead. I stood in the lobby of the glass tower surrounded by people rushing to their jobs, people who had no idea that a man's heart had just been ripped out of his chest next to the fern planter. I looked at my phone. The recording was saved, 1 minute and 45 seconds. It was the evidence of my son's betrayal. It was the legal proof I would need when they inevitably tried to claim I was incompetent or owed them support. It was the sound of a door slamming shut forever. I put the phone in my pocket. I walked out to the curb. My driver pulled the Rolls-Royce around. I got into the back seat. I didn't cry. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the console. I looked out at the city I owned a piece of. I had lost a son, but I had gained clarity. Tyrell wanted a war. He wanted to worship a false idol. Fine. I would show him what a real god of industry looked like when he was angry. I tapped on the glass partition. I told my driver to take me to the bank. I had a mortgage to buy. I watched my son self-destruct in high definition through the screen of a burner phone. Over the next 3 weeks, Tyrell and Courtney did not just spend money. They lit it on fire and danced around the flames. I created a fake Instagram account just to keep an eye on the train wreck. Every day brought a new post, a new flex, a new lie. There was a picture of Courtney holding a Hermes Birkin bag that cost more than my first car. The caption read #blessed, #boss life, #Bishop investments. She did not know that bag was paid for with the equity of her own home. She did not know she was carrying her roof on her arm. Then there was Tyrell. He posted a video of himself popping bottles of champagne at a club on a Tuesday night. He was shouting over the music about passive income and generational wealth. He looked manic. He looked thin. He was high on the fumes of a fantasy. Bishop King had them hooked. He was paying them small monthly dividends, likely giving them back $500 of their own money while he pocketed the other $49,500. It was the classic Ponzi drip feed. He made them feel rich so they would not notice they were bleeding to death. I sat in my peeling kitchen in South Chicago and drank my black coffee. I scrolled past a photo of them dining at a steakhouse, the same one where they had humiliated me. They were smiling, their teeth white and perfect, completely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath them had already been sold. They thought they were climbing the social ladder. In reality, they were just greasing the slide to the bottom. It was painful to watch, but I did not look away. I needed to see the extent of their greed. I needed to know exactly how much rope they were using to hang themselves. When Courtney posted a story about looking for vacation homes in the Hamptons, I knew it was time to move. I put down the phone. I put on my old coat. It was time to go to work. The headquarters of Freeman Logistics is a fortress of gray stone and tinted glass on the edge of the industrial district. It does not have a flashy sign. It does not need one. The people who need to know where we are already know. I walked past the security guard at the front desk. He stood up and straightened his tie. "Good morning, Mr. Freeman," he said with a nod of genuine respect. He did not see a bum in an old coat. He saw the man who signed his paycheck and paid for his daughter's braces. I nodded back and took the private elevator to the top floor. Mrs. Harper was waiting for me in the conference room. She was a woman of steel and mathematics, 60 years old, with eyes that could spot a decimal error from across the room. She had been my personal attorney for 20 years. She was the only person on earth who knew the exact dimensions of my empire. When I walked in, she did not comment on my attire. She simply slid a folder across the mahogany table. The papers were crisp and smelled of ink and power. She told me the incorporation papers were ready. She said ZF Capital was officially a registered entity. She asked me if I was sure I wanted to fund it with personal liquidity. I sat down. I took out my checkbook. It was not the one I showed Tyrell. This was the one from my private vault. I uncapped my pen. I wrote the date. I wrote the payee, ZF Capital. Then I wrote the number, 5000000, $50 million. I signed my name, Ezekiel Freeman. I slid the check back to her. I told her I had never been more sure of anything in my life. I told her this was not an investment for profit. It was an investment in justice. I told her that money is usually a shield, but today I was forging it into a sword. Harper looked at the check. She looked at me. She adjusted her glasses. She asked me what the first acquisition target was. She expected me to say a shipping lane or a warehouse district. I leaned forward. I told her I wanted to buy a debt. I told her I wanted to buy the mortgage on 421 Maple Drive. Harper paused. She knew that address. It was my son's house. She looked at me with a question in her eyes, but she did not ask it. She saw the look on my face. It was not the look of a father coming to the rescue. It was the look of a general cutting off the enemy's supply line. She nodded once. She picked up her phone. She said she would call the bank immediately. She said subprime mortgages were trading cheap, and the local bank would be happy to offload a high-risk loan. I stood up and walked to the window looking out over the rail yard that moved my containers across the country. I told her to make sure the transfer was airtight. I told her I wanted the title, the deed, and the right to foreclose in my hand by the end of the week. Harper worked with the efficiency of a guillotine. 3 days later, the paperwork was on my desk. The local bank had been all too eager to sell the note on Tyrell's house. They saw a young man with maxed-out credit cards and a second mortgage taken out with a shady investment firm. To them, it was a toxic asset. To me, it was leverage. I sat in my high-back leather chair and held the document. It was heavy. It was the legal ownership of the roof over my son's head. Tyrell thought he was paying a faceless bank. He thought he was dealing with a corporate algorithm that might give him a grace period if he missed a payment. He did not know that his new landlord was the man he had called a dead weight. He did not know that ZF Capital was just me in a different suit. I looked at the terms. The interest rate on his second mortgage, the one Bishop had arranged, was predatory. It was designed to fail. Bishop had likely taken a kickback from the lender. My son was being eaten alive from both ends. I took a pen and signed the transfer agreement. It was done. I was now the silent owner of Tyrell's sanctuary. I put the document in my safe. I did not call him. I did not send a letter. I just waited. I knew Bishop's payments would stop eventually. I knew the Ponzi scheme would collapse. And when it did, when the fake dividends dried up and the real bills came due, Tyrell would stop paying his mortgage to feed his lifestyle. He would think he could get away with it for a few months. He would think he could charm the bank. But the next notice he received would not be a friendly reminder. It would be a demand for payment in full from ZF Capital. I sat back and closed my eyes. I imagined the look on his face when he realized the bank was not calling. I imagined the panic. It brought me no joy, but it brought me a cold, hard satisfaction. He wanted to cut me out of his life. He wanted to erase me. But now every time he turned on a light switch, every time he walked through his front door, he was walking on my territory. He was living in my world now. And in my world, you pay what you owe. The invitation was heavy cardstock with gold leaf lettering that flaked off if you rubbed it too hard. It announced the imminent initial public offering of King Global Enterprises. It was a celebration of a company that did not exist, held in a rented ballroom at the downtown Hyatt, that smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner and stale ambition. I arrived late. I wore my best church suit, a navy blue number that was clean but cut in a style that died in the 90s. I did not wear it to be stylish. I wore it because I knew exactly how much it would irritate my daughter-in-law. The room was packed with people who looked hungry. There were investors in ill-fitting tuxedos and women in gowns that were too tight, all of them holding glasses of cheap champagne and looking at Bishop King as if he were a messiah who was about to turn their water into wine. Bishop was on a raised platform in the center of the room, bathed in a spotlight, holding a microphone like a rock star. He was talking about synergy and paradigm shifts using big words he clearly did not understand to hide the fact that he was selling air. I spotted Tyrell standing near the front, clapping so hard his hands must have stung. He looked desperate to believe. He looked like a man who had bet his life on a horse with 3 legs. I started to make my way toward him, weaving through the crowd of true believers. I wanted to look him in the eye one more time before the floor fell out, but I did not make it to Tyrell. Courtney intercepted me like a linebacker in a sequined dress. She appeared out of the crowd, her face a mask of panic and social terror. She grabbed my arm with a grip that was painful. She steered me away from the center of the room, pushing me toward a group of potential investors she had been charming. She looked at them with a bright fake smile and then gestured to me with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Oh, excuse me, everyone," she said, her voice high and trilling. "This is just Zeke. He has been our family gardener for years. He is practically part of the furniture. I think he just came by to see the floral arrangements. Isn't that sweet?" The investors smiled politely, looking at me with the vague disinterest one reserves for the help. "Hello, Zeke," one of them said. "Nice work on the roses." I stood there frozen. My own daughter-in-law. The woman who was sleeping in a house I effectively owned. The woman whose credit card bills I had secretly paid for years. She had just reduced my entire existence to that of a hired hand because the truth of who I was, a blue-collar father from South Chicago, was too damaging to her brand. I felt a heat rise in my chest that had nothing to do with the crowded room. I looked at Courtney. She was glaring at me, her eyes pleading with me to play along, to be small, to be silent. I smiled. It was a cold smile. "The flowers are indeed beautiful," I said to the investor. "But you have to be careful with the soil. If the roots are rotten, it doesn't matter how pretty the petals are. The whole thing will die eventually." Courtney's smile faltered. She dug her nails into my arm and hissed under her breath for me to go find a drink in the back. She turned back to her marks, laughing too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny. I walked away, but I didn't go to the back. I went to work. I circulated through the room. I played the part of the confused old man perfectly. I shuffled. I kept my head down. I let people bump into me, but my left arm was held at a specific angle. On my wrist was a smartwatch, a piece of technology that cost more than Bishop's entire wardrobe. It was recording everything in high-fidelity audio. I stood next to a group of young men who looked like they had leveraged their student loans to be here. Bishop had descended from his stage and was holding court. I drifted closer, sipping a glass of flat ginger ale. I heard Bishop's voice clearly. He was making promises that were mathematically impossible. "We are guaranteeing a 200% return by the third quarter," Bishop said, slapping a young man on the back. "We have secured mineral rights in Nevada that are going to explode. The IPO is just a formality. You get in now, you are buying a ticket to the moon." I tapped the screen on my watch. Marker added, "That was fraud. Plain and simple. You cannot guarantee returns. You definitely cannot guarantee 200% returns on mineral rights that do not exist." I moved to another group. Tyrell was there repeating the lies he had been fed. "My stepfather is a genius," Tyrell was saying. "He has insider knowledge. We are leveraging our home equity because we know it is a sure thing. We are going to be retiring in Fiji next year." I recorded that too. I recorded my son digging his own grave with his mouth. It broke my heart, but I needed the record. I needed to prove that Tyrell was not just a victim but an active participant in recruiting others into the scam. He was liable. He was exposed. I walked past a table where legal documents were being signed. I saw money changing hands. Cash, checks. I saw the greed in people's eyes. It was a feeding frenzy. Bishop King was the shark, and my son was the chum. I had enough. The air in the room was suffocating. It smelled of cheap cologne and expensive lies. I needed to wash my face. I headed for the restrooms near the kitchen entrance, the only place where the noise of the party dulled to a thrum. I walked into the men's room. It was empty except for one man washing his hands at the sink. He was wearing a gray suit that fit too well to be off the rack. He had a haircut that was military precise. He didn't look like an investor. He looked like a shark of a different kind. I went to the sink next to him and turned on the tap. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to wash away the feeling of Courtney's hand on my arm. I looked up into the mirror. The man in the gray suit was looking at me. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He dried his hands with a paper towel, taking his time. Then he turned to leave. As he passed me, he leaned in close. He didn't stop walking, but he spoke directly into my ear. His voice was low, flat, and terrifyingly calm. "Get him out, old-timer," he whispered. I froze. I turned to look at him. He stopped at the door, his hand on the handle. He looked back at me. His eyes were cold and hard. "Your son," he said. "Tell him to pull his money and run. Tonight. We have been building the case for 6 months. The raid is scheduled for Tuesday. It is over." He opened the door and walked out, disappearing into the noise of the party. I stood there in the silence of the tiled room. The water was still running. My heart hammered against my ribs. That was not a concerned citizen. That was the FBI. They were already here. They were inside. The timeline had just collapsed. I thought I had months to teach Tyrell a lesson. I thought I could let him fail slowly and then catch him, but I was wrong. The hammer was about to drop. If Tyrell was still listed as a partner on Tuesday, he wouldn't just lose his house. He would lose his freedom. He would go to federal prison. I looked at myself in the mirror. The gardener, the beggar, the dead weight. I turned off the water. I dried my face. I had to make a choice. I could let justice take its course and watch my son go to jail for his stupidity and greed. Or I could try one last time to save him from the fire he had lit. I walked out of the bathroom. I didn't look at the stage. I didn't look at the investors. I looked for my son. I had to warn him. Not as the landlord, not as the millionaire, but as the father who remembered holding him when he was small enough to fit in one arm. I had to try, even if he hated me for it, even if he spit in my face. I had to give him one last chance to jump off the sinking ship before the torpedo hit. The snow in Chicago does not fall gently. It attacks. It comes in sideways off the lake like 1,000 frozen needles seeking out every gap in your clothing. I drove my old truck to Maple Drive because taking the Rolls-Royce would have defeated the purpose. I needed to be Tyrell's father tonight, not his banker. I pulled up to the house that I technically owned. The windows were glowing with warm yellow light. I could see the silhouette of a Christmas tree in the living room window, even though it was only November. They were playing house inside a structure that was built on quicksand. I walked up the driveway. The wind whipped my coat around my legs. My knuckles were raw from the cold, but I pounded on the heavy oak door with everything I had. I did not ring the bell. This was not a social call. This was a rescue mission. I shouted for Tyrell. I shouted for him to open the door. I yelled that we did not have time. I yelled that the FBI was coming on Tuesday. I yelled that Bishop King was a fraud and that the raid was already scheduled. I screamed at the wood and the glass, hoping that my voice would penetrate the wall of delusion they had built around themselves. I stood there, in the swirling white dark, shivering not just from the temperature, but from the terrified certainty that my son was about to walk into a cage he could not see. I pounded until my hand ached. I shouted until my throat was raw. I told them about the man in the bathroom. I told them about the empty binders. I told them to pull their money out now tonight before the accounts were frozen at 9 in the morning. I was begging. For the first time in 40 years, I was begging. The door did not open. Instead, a small circle of blue light illuminated on the doorframe. It was the video doorbell. Courtney's voice crackled through the speaker, tiny and distorted and dripping with venom. She asked me if I was drunk. She asked me if I had finally lost my mind completely. I leaned into the camera, my face wet with melting snow, my eyes wide with urgency. I told her to listen to me. I told her to get Tyrell. I told her they were going to prison. Courtney laughed. It was a tinny digital sound. She said I was pathetic. She said I was standing on their porch screaming lies because I could not stand the fact that Bishop had succeeded where I had failed. She said I was jealous. She said I was a bitter old man who wanted to drag them back down to the gutter. She said Bishop had warned them that I would try something like this. She said Bishop told them I would try to sabotage their success because I was afraid of being left behind. She told me to get off her property. She used that word, her property. She had no idea that the foreclosure papers were already sitting on my desk waiting for my signature. She had no idea that she was shouting at her landlord. She told me that if I did not leave immediately, she would call the police and have me removed for trespassing. She said she did not want her neighbors to see her crazy father-in-law making a scene. The blue light on the doorbell went dark. The connection was cut. I was left standing alone in the howling wind, screaming at a piece of plastic. I stepped back from the door. I looked up at the second-floor window. The light was on in the master bedroom. The window slid open. Tyrell stepped out onto the small balcony. He was wearing a silk robe that he had probably charged to a maxed-out card. He looked down at me. For a second, I thought he had come to listen. I thought he had come to hear the warning. I opened my mouth to speak. I started to say his name. Tyrell lifted a large plastic bucket from the floor of the balcony. He did not hesitate. He did not flinch. With a smooth, practiced motion, he heaved the contents over the railing. The water hit me like a physical blow. It was ice cold. It soaked my hair, my coat, my shirt. It ran down my neck and into my boots. In the sub-zero temperature, the shock was instantaneous. My body seized. The air was punched out of my lungs. I stood there gasping, freezing, the water already beginning to stiffen my clothes. Tyrell leaned over the railing. He shouted down at me. He told me to cool off. He told me to wash away the jealousy. He said I was a stain on his life, and he was washing me away. He slammed the window shut and drew the curtains. I stood there in the snow. I was shaking violently, but the cold inside my chest was far worse than the ice on my skin. I couldn't feel my fingers, but I could feel the death of my hope. My son was gone. The boy I raised was dead. The man in that house was a stranger who had just assaulted me. I had tried to save him as a father. He had rejected me as an enemy. I turned around. I walked back to my truck, my clothes crunching as they froze. I got inside and turned the heater to the maximum, but I knew I would never feel warm again. I reached into my wet pocket and pulled out my phone. My fingers were stiff and clumsy. I found the number for Harper. I did not call. I typed 2 words. Proceed immediately. I hit send. I watched the message deliver. Then I put the truck in gear and drove away. I was done saving Tyrell Freeman. It was time to collect what he owed. 3 months passed in a silence that was heavy and cold, like the winter air settling over the lake. I did not call my son. I did not drive past the house I secretly owned. I sat in my corner office at Freeman Logistics and I waited. I watched the news feeds and the financial tickers on my wall of screens. I knew the timing. I knew the math. A Ponzi scheme is a living thing and it needs constant food to survive. When the new money stops coming in, the beast starves and dies. It happened on a Tuesday morning just as the sky was turning the color of a bruised plum. The breaking news alert flashed across every monitor in Chicago. Federal agents had raided the offices of King Global Enterprises. The footage was chaotic. Men in windbreakers with those 3 yellow letters on the back were carrying out boxes of files. They were the same empty binders I had seen months ago, now evidence of a crime that ran into the millions. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, CEO missing in multi-million-dollar fraud. Bishop King was gone. He had vanished into the ether, likely on a non-extradition flight to a country with warm beaches and banking secrecy laws. He left behind a crater where my son's future used to be. I watched the news anchor explain the mechanics of the collapse. It was textbook. Bishop had been paying old investors with new money, skimming the top for his Bentley leases and his gold chains. But the music had stopped and there were no chairs left. I sipped my coffee black and hot. I felt no joy. I felt no vindication. I only felt the grim certainty of gravity. What goes up on a lie must come down in ruins. The fallout hit Maple Drive with the speed of a shockwave. I knew exactly when it happened because I had set up alerts on the mortgage account. Tyrell tried to use his debit card at a gas station. Declined. Courtney tried to buy a latte. Declined. Their accounts were not just empty. They were frozen by federal regulators as part of the sweeping investigation into Bishop's associates. They were radioactive, but the banks were the least of their problems. Bishop had not just taken their cash. He had used Tyrell's personal information, his social security number, and his signature to secure high-interest loans from men who did not use lawyers to collect debts. I saw the footage from the security camera I had legally installed to monitor the perimeter of my property. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the driveway. 2 large men got out. They did not knock on the door. They kicked it. I watched on my screen as Tyrell cowered in the doorway, his face pale and sweating. I saw Courtney screaming behind him, clutching her robe. The men were not there for conversation. They were there to deliver a message. One of them grabbed Tyrell by the collar of his silk shirt and slammed him against the brickwork. They left him with a bruised rib and a deadline. He had inherited Bishop's debts, but not his getaway plane. Inside the house, the panic was absolute. I could practically smell the fear through the video feed. They were trapped in a luxury cage with no food, no money, and predators circling the lawn. They called Bishop's number 100 times. It went straight to voicemail. They called their friends. No one answered. They were toxic. They were alone. They had burned every bridge they had, including the one that led to me. They sat in the dark because the power company had cut the electricity an hour ago, huddled together on a sofa they did not own in a house that was already lost. Then came the final blow. The one I delivered personally, though they did not know it came from me. I instructed Harper to send the letter. It was sent via certified mail requiring a signature. I watched on the camera as the mail carrier handed the thick envelope to a trembling Courtney. She tore it open right there on the porch, her hands shaking so hard she almost dropped the paper. It was on heavy bond paper with the letterhead ZF capital. It was not a warning. It was not a request for payment. It was a notice of default and acceleration. It stated clearly that due to non-payment and violation of the loan terms, the lender was exercising its right to foreclose. The house was no longer theirs. They had 30 days to vacate the premises, 30 days to pack their fake designer bags and their leased furniture, 30 days to find a hole to crawl into. Courtney collapsed onto the porch steps, wailing into her hands. Tyrell snatched the letter from her. He read it, his face turning the color of ash. He looked around the neighborhood, his eyes wild, looking for a savior that did not exist. He realized the walls were closing in. He realized that ZF Capital was a shark, and it smelled blood. I sat in my office miles away and closed the file. Phase 1 was complete. The eviction had begun. Desperation has a smell. It smells like cold sweat and cheap car interior. I watched my son and his wife drive back to South Chicago, not because they wanted to, but because gravity pulls trash to the lowest point. They parked their leased SUV, which was days away from repossession, in front of my building. They looked out at the peeling paint and the barred windows. A month ago they had sneered at this place. Now it was their only hope for a roof over their heads. They grabbed their overnight bags and ran to the front door like rats scurrying for a sewer grate. Tyrell jammed his old key into the lock of Unit 1B. He twisted it. Nothing happened. He twisted it harder, rattling the handle. He did not know that as a landlord, the first thing you do when a tenant becomes a liability is change the cylinders. He started pounding on the door. He shouted for me. He shouted that it was an emergency. He shouted that they had nowhere else to go. He thought I was inside, sitting in my armchair waiting to be gracious. He was wrong. The door flew open, but it was not me standing there. It was Marcus, the Hammer Washington, a heavyweight boxer I had rented the unit to for $1 a month just to keep the riffraff out. Marcus filled the doorway. He was 6'5" of muscle and bad attitude. He looked down at Tyrell and Courtney shivering in their designer coats. Tyrell stammered. He asked where his father was. He said this was his father's apartment. Marcus did not blink. He told them nobody named Zeke lived there anymore. He said the unit was leased. He said I was gone. Courtney tried to push past him, her desperation making her stupid. She screamed that she needed to come in. She screamed that she had rights. Marcus simply placed a hand the size of a shovel on Tyrell's chest and shoved. It was not a violent shove, just a firm reminder of physics. Tyrell flew backward off the stoop and landed hard on the frozen pavement. Marcus told them that if they came back, he would not be so polite next time. He slammed the door. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the empty street. They scrambled back to their car, locking the doors as if the neighborhood itself was trying to eat them. They were hyperventilating. The heater was blasting, but they were shaking with a cold that went down to the bone. Tyrell pulled out his phone. His hands were trembling so badly he dropped it twice before he could dial. He called my number, the number he had ignored for years, the number he had blocked when he was riding high with Bishop. He put it on speaker. The automated voice was cool and final. The number you have reached has been disconnected or is no longer in service. Tyrell stared at the phone. He dialed again. Same result. He tried to text me. Message failed to deliver. He looked at Courtney, and for the first time I saw the dawn of true terror in his eyes. He realized I was not just mad. I was not just sulking. I had erased myself. I had vanished. To them, I was the safety net that was always supposed to be there no matter how much they cut the strings. Now they were falling and there was nothing below them but concrete. They sat in that car for an hour calling everyone they could think of. They called the hospitals. They called the police non-emergency line asking if an old man had been found confused or wandering. They were told nothing. They realized that without me, They had no access to resources. They had no access to my small pension they thought they could steal. They had no access to the apartment. I had become a ghost. And ghosts cannot be manipulated. Ghosts cannot be guilted into signing checks. They were alone in a city that wanted to devour them with predators closing in from every side. Courtney started rummaging through a box of old papers they had managed to grab from their house before the eviction notice became a physical removal. It was a desperate search for anything they could sell or leverage. She was throwing tax returns and old birthday cards into the back seat. Then she stopped. Her hand froze on a document that was yellowed with age. It was a copy of a life insurance policy I had taken out 30 years ago when I was working the docks. It was a standard term life policy with a payout of $100,000. I had forgotten I even had it in that box. To me, it was pocket change. To them, it was a fortune. Courtney held the paper up to the dashboard light. Her eyes scanned the terms. Beneficiary Tyrell Freeman. Her breathing changed. It slowed down. The panic in her face smoothed out into something sharp and focused. She looked at the date. It was still active. She looked at the payout conditions. Death, or declared death in absentia after a period of missing person status. She turned to Tyrell. Her eyes were not the eyes of a scared wife anymore. They were the eyes of a wolf that had just found a wounded deer. She whispered that $100,000 could get them out of the country. She said it could buy them new identities. She said it could fix everything. Tyrell looked at the paper and then at her. He asked what she meant. He said I wasn't dead. Courtney looked out the window at the dark, empty street where I had supposedly vanished. She said I was old. She said I was confused. She said people like me went missing all the time in neighborhoods like this. She said if I never came back, it would be a tragedy, but it would also be a solution. She looked back at Tyrell, and the predatory gleam in her eyes was unmistakable. She said that if I was already missing, maybe they just needed to make sure I stayed missing. She said that if the police thought I had wandered off into the cold and had an accident, nobody would look too closely. Tyrell did not pull away. He did not tell her she was crazy. He looked at the policy. He looked at the dollar sign. And then he looked at her and nodded. In the silence of that car, I watched my son agree to the idea that my death was the only way he could live. My private investigator slid a manila envelope across the mahogany desk of my hidden office. The contents were not just evidence of greed, they were evidence of a conspiracy to commit bodily harm. There were grainy telephoto shots of Courtney meeting with a man in a parked car behind a derelict strip mall. The man was Dr. Eris, a disgraced physician who had lost his license 3 years ago for running a pill mill. He was known on the street as the guy you went to when you needed a signature on a document that no ethical doctor would touch. The investigator laid out the timeline. Courtney had paid Eris $2,000 in cash she got from selling her engagement ring. In exchange, Eris was preparing a retroactive medical file. It stated that I had been showing signs of violent dementia for years. It claimed I was a danger to myself and others. It recommended immediate involuntary commitment to a state facility, but the file was just the paperwork. The physical weapon was in the receipt the investigator placed on top of the photos. It was from an online black market pharmacy. Courtney had ordered a bottle of liquid benzodiazepines concentrated strength. It was enough to knock out a linebacker for 2 days. If given to a man of 70 with a history of heart trouble, it could stop his pulse completely. They were not just trying to put me away. They were willing to risk killing me to get the guardianship papers signed. If I was incapacitated, they became my legal proxies. They could access my accounts, liquidate my assets, and pull the plug on my life support whenever it became convenient. I looked at the photos of my daughter-in-law buying the chemical handcuffs she intended to put on my brain. I felt a cold rage that was sharper than any knife. They wanted to play doctor. I decided it was time to schedule an appointment. The lure came 2 days later in the form of a frantic email to my old address, which they knew I still checked on my phone. It was a forwarded message from a fake email account labeled St. Mary's Urgent Care. It claimed that my recent blood work showed markers for a rapid onset neurological event. It was a clumsy forgery pasted together with medical jargon they probably found on Wikipedia. Tyrell followed it up with a message to a burner number he had managed to track down, likely by going through my old phone records. He begged me to meet them. He said he wanted to make sure I was safe. He said he wanted to discuss treatment options. He said he wanted to make peace before I forgot who he was. I agreed to meet them at a diner on 47th Street, a place with high-backed booths and dim lighting. I arrived early. I did not come alone. Two of my security team were seated in the booth directly behind the one reserved for us. They were invisible to the untrained eye, just two guys eating burgers, but they were recording everything. I sat down and waited. I made sure my hands were trembling. I made sure my eyes looked unfocused. I played the part of the confused, dying old man they so desperately wanted me to be. Tyrell and Courtney arrived 10 minutes late. They looked like they hadn't slept in a week. Their clothes were wrinkled, and there was a frantic energy vibrating off them. They sat down opposite me. Courtney was overly solicitous. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her palms were sweating. She told me how worried they were. She told me the doctor said I needed immediate stabilization. She said they had found a wonderful facility where I would be taken care of. She called it a sanctuary. I knew the place she was talking about. It was a warehouse in Gary, Indiana, where they strapped patients to beds and fed them gruel. The waitress brought a pitcher of water and 3 glasses. Courtney jumped to pour. She filled my glass first. I watched her hand hover over the rim for a fraction of a second too long. I saw the tiny, clear droplet fall from her sleeve into the water. It was a sleight of hand she must have practiced in the mirror. She pushed the glass toward me with a smile that was tight and terrifying. "Drink up, Dad," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You need to stay hydrated. The doctor said dehydration makes the confusion worse." I looked at the water. I looked at her. I looked at Tyrell. He was staring at the table, unable to meet my eyes. He knew. He was letting her do it. I reached for the glass. My hand shook violently. I knocked my fork off the table. It clattered loudly onto the tile floor. Tyrell and Courtney both flinched and looked down instinctively. In that split second of distraction, I moved. My hand steadied instantly. I switched my glass with Courtney's. The movement was a blur. By the time they looked back up, I was holding the fork and looking confused again. I picked up the glass that had been sitting in front of her. I took a long sip. "Your turn, Courtney," I said. "You look thirsty." She didn't hesitate. She was so focused on watching me die that she didn't even look at what she was holding. She grabbed the glass I had pushed toward her and drained half of it in one gulp. 10 minutes passed. We talked about the weather. We talked about my health. Then Courtney's speech began to slur. Her eyelids drooped. She giggled at nothing. The drug hit her fast and hard. Her filter evaporated. She leaned across the table and pointed a limp finger at me. "You know, Zeke," she mumbled, her head lolling to the side, "you are going to love the new place. It smells like pee, but it is cheap. So cheap. $400 a month. That leaves plenty for us." Tyrell's eyes went wide. He tried to grab her arm, but she swatted him away. She continued her confession, her voice thick and syrupy. "We are going to get guardianship, Zeke. We are going to sign the papers while you are drooling in the corner. We are going to take the house back. We are going to take the pension. We are going to take it all. You are just a useless old bag of bones anyway." She laughed, a wet, gurgling sound, and then her head hit the table with a thud. She was out cold. I stopped shaking. I sat up straight. I looked at Tyrell, who was staring at his unconscious wife in horror. I pulled out a napkin and wiped my mouth. "I told you I was not thirsty, Tyrell," I said, my voice steady and cold. Tyrell looked at me. He realized then that I was not confused. He realized I was not sick. He realized he was sitting across from a man who had just outmaneuvered him without standing up. I stood up. I threw a $100 bill on the table. I told him to take her to the hospital. I told him to tell the doctors what she took. I told him I would be keeping the recording of her confession for the police. I walked out of the diner, leaving my son with a comatose wife and the realization that he had just tried to poison the only person who could have saved him. I did not call the police on my son for the poisoning attempt immediately because prison was too easy for him. I wanted him to lose everything first. I wanted him to feel the walls close in until he had no air left to breathe. Tyrell made his move 3 days after Courtney was discharged from the hospital. He walked into the office of a discount bankruptcy attorney, someone whose face was on a billboard next to the highway. He filed for Chapter 7 protection. It was a desperate gambit, but a calculated one. He knew that bankruptcy triggers an automatic stay. It stops all collection efforts. It stops the foreclosure dead in its tracks. He thought he had bought himself time. He thought he had found a loophole that would let him keep the lifestyle he had stolen. Under the homestead exemption laws, he believed he could wipe out the unsecured debts from Bishop's sharks and force the mortgage holder to renegotiate the terms. He was banking on the idea that ZF Capital was a massive faceless hedge fund in New York or London. He assumed that a fund managing billions would not waste time and expensive legal fees chasing a single residential mortgage in Chicago. He thought he was a rounding error to me. He thought he was insignificant. He did not know that ZF Capital had only one asset and one mission. He did not know that the entire board of directors was sitting in a Rolls-Royce watching him sign the papers that would seal his fate. He walked out of that lawyer's office with a strut I had not seen in months. He thought he had beaten the system. He thought he had outsmarted the bank. He went home to the house he had not paid for in months and told Courtney that everything was going to be fine. He told her they would keep the house. He told her the debts would vanish like smoke. He was celebrating a victory that was actually a confession. I sat in the conference room at Freeman Logistics with Harper. The air conditioning was humming a low, steady note. On the table between us lay the bankruptcy petition Tyrell had filed with the federal court. It was a document of pure fiction. It was not just inaccurate, it was a felony recorded in black and white. We went through the schedules line by line. Schedule A-B requires the debtor to list all personal property. Tyrell had checked none for almost every category. Under jewelry, he listed 0. I pulled up a photo on my tablet. It was taken 2 weeks ago. Tyrell was wearing a Breitling Navitimer watch. Value $8,000. Under clothing, he listed $100. I pulled up another photo. He was wearing a Gucci belt and Balenciaga sneakers worth more than my truck. Under cash on hand, he wrote $50. My investigator had photos of him withdrawing $2,000 from an ATM the day before the filing trying to hide liquid assets. He had transferred the title of the Mercedes to a friend the week before, which was a fraudulent conveyance. He had hidden Courtney's designer bags in a storage unit rented under her maiden name. He had lied about his income. He had lied about his expenses. He had signed his name under penalty of perjury declaring that he was destitute while hiding $50,000 worth of luxury goods. Harper looked at me over the rim of her glasses. She said, "This is not just a bad filing, Zeke." She said, "This is bankruptcy fraud." She said, "This is a federal crime." She said, "We have him." I looked at my son's signature on the bottom of the page. It was the same signature he had used to try and steal my identity. I nodded. I told her to proceed. I told her I did not want a settlement. I wanted a trial. Harper drafted the complaint that afternoon. She did not just file a standard objection. She filed an adversary proceeding. It is a lawsuit within the bankruptcy case. We were suing Tyrell in federal court to deny him the discharge of his debts based on fraud and concealment of assets. We attached the photos. We attached the bank records. We attached the proof of the car transfer. We built a cage out of paper and locked him inside. The process server found Tyrell at the pharmacy where he was picking up Courtney's new prescriptions. Tyrell took the thick packet of legal documents. He glanced at the cover page. United States Bankruptcy Court. Plaintiff ZF Capital. Defendant Tyrell Freeman. He did not look scared. He looked annoyed. He tossed the papers onto the passenger seat of his car like it was junk mail. He called Courtney on speakerphone as he drove away. I heard the conversation through the tap on his phone. He told her not to worry. He laughed a dry, arrogant sound. He said it is just a formality, baby. He said these big funds always file an objection automatically just to see if we settle. He said they will not show up to court. He said it costs them more to send a lawyer than the debt is worth. He said we are going to walk in there, say we are broke, and walk out free. He said nobody cares about us, Zeke. He said we are invisible. He drove home to the house he thought he had saved completely unaware that he was driving straight into the teeth of the trap. He thought he was invisible. He was about to become the center of attention. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago is a place designed to make you feel small. The ceilings are too high and the benches are too hard and the air is recycled so many times it tastes like old pennies. I sat in the back row of courtroom 4B wearing a hat pulled low and a scarf wrapped around my face. I was invisible. Tyrell and Courtney sat at the defendant's table. They had dressed for the occasion. Tyrell was wearing a suit that was 2 sizes too big, likely bought at a thrift store the day before to make him look shrunken and pathetic. Courtney was wearing a plain gray cardigan and no makeup. She looked pale. She looked fragile. It was a performance worthy of an Oscar. They stood before Judge Sterling, a man known for his leniency toward debtors who had fallen on hard times. Tyrell spoke first. His voice was a masterpiece of trembling humility. He told the judge that he was a simple man who had been targeted by a sophisticated predator. He painted Bishop King as a monster who had groomed him for years. He said he had only mortgaged the house because he wanted to give his wife a better life. He said they had lost everything. He said they were currently living on the charity of friends, which was a lie because they were squatting in a motel using the cash they had hidden. Then it was Courtney's turn. She wept. She did not just cry, she wept. She told the judge that they were good people who had made a mistake. She said they had learned their lesson. She said they just wanted a fresh start so they could raise their unborn child in peace. She did not mention that she was not pregnant. She did not mention the poison. She placed a hand on her stomach and looked at the judge with wide, tear-filled eyes. She said, "Your Honor, we have nothing left. We have sold every stick of furniture. We are eating ramen noodles. We just want the harassing phone calls to stop. We just want to be safe." The judge nodded slowly. I could see he was buying it. He looked at them and saw two young kids who got in over their heads. He looked at the empty plaintiff's table where Harper was sitting alone, and he saw a big, mean corporation trying to crush the little guy. He leaned forward. He said the court is inclined to grant the discharge. He said it appears the debtors have been victims of significant fraud and have no remaining assets to liquidate. Tyrell squeezed Courtney's hand. I saw the ghost of a smirk touch his lips. They thought they had won. They thought they had acted their way out of a hole. Then Harper stood up. She did not look like a shark. She looked like a librarian who had just found a book that was overdue by 10 years. She adjusted her glasses. She picked up a single piece of paper. She said, "Your Honor, before you rule ZF Capital, would like to introduce evidence regarding the debtor's schedule of assets." Tyrell rolled his eyes. He whispered something to Courtney, probably telling her not to worry. Harper walked to the podium. She looked at Courtney. She asked Mrs. Freeman, "You stated under oath that you have sold all personal property of value, is that correct?" Courtney nodded vigorously. "Yes, ma'am. Everything. Even my wedding ring." Harper placed the paper on the overhead projector. An image appeared on the screens around the courtroom. It was a high-resolution photograph of Courtney standing at the counter of a luxury consignment shop in the Gold Coast. The timestamp was dated 3 days ago. She was handing over a bright orange Hermes Birkin bag. Harper spoke clearly. "This is a photo of you, Mrs. Freeman, selling a handbag 3 days after you filed for bankruptcy protection. The bag is valued at $12,000. You did not list this bag on your asset schedule. You did not declare the cash you received from this sale." Courtney went white. She stammered. She said that was an old fake. She said she only got $50 for it. Harper switched the slide. It was a copy of the receipt from the shop. It showed a cash payout of $7,500. Harper looked at the judge. "Your Honor, the debtor concealed a luxury asset, sold it for cash post-petition, and failed to report the income. This is not a mistake. This is bankruptcy fraud. And we have reason to believe this is just the tip of the iceberg. We have evidence of a Breitling watch sold last week. We have evidence of cash withdrawals. The debtors are not destitute. They are hoarding assets while asking this court to wipe away their obligations." The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted instantly. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. Judge Sterling's face hardened. He looked at Tyrell and Courtney. The sympathy was gone. It was replaced by the cold anger of a man who realizes he is being played. Tyrell stood up, knocking his chair back. He shouted that it was a lie. He shouted that the photos were doctored. He said ZF Capital was harassing them. He said, "Who are these people anyway?" He said, "Why are they obsessed with us? It is just a mortgage." The judge banged his gavel. He told Tyrell to sit down. He turned his gaze to Harper. He asked if the plaintiff had a representative present who could speak to the intent of the foreclosure. He asked if ZF Capital was willing to negotiate a payment plan given the revelations of fraud, or if they were seeking immediate liquidation of the collateral. He looked over his spectacles at Harper. He said, "Ms. Harper, does your client have a specific position on how they wish to proceed with these assets? I would like to hear from the principal of ZF Capital directly if possible. Is there a representative in the building, or are we dealing with a board of directors in New York?" Harper smiled. It was a very small, very dangerous smile. She said, "Your Honor, ZF Capital is a sole proprietorship. The chairman takes a very personal interest in his investments. He is not in New York." Tyrell scoffed. He muttered that nobody cares about a $50 million fund chairman coming to a bankruptcy hearing for a suburban house. He said they are probably sending some junior VP to waste our time. Harper turned to the back of the courtroom. She looked directly at where I was sitting. She said, "Actually, Your Honor, the chairman is entering the courtroom right now." I stood up. I took off the hat. I unwound the scarf. I unbuttoned my old trench coat and let it slide off my shoulders onto the bench. Underneath, I was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than Tyrell's car. I adjusted my silk tie. I picked up my leather briefcase. I walked down the center aisle. The sound of my shoes on the floor was a steady rhythmic hammer beat. Tyrell turned around. He looked at me. He blinked. He did not understand what he was seeing. He saw his father, but he did not see the gardener. He saw a man who walked with the weight of a titan. He saw the suit. He saw the watch. He saw the eyes that had watched him throw water on a beggar in the snow. I walked through the gate. I stood next to Harper. I looked at the judge. I looked at my son. I said, "Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Ezekiel Freeman. I am the chairman of ZF Capital. And I am the owner of the debt, the house, and the very expensive watch my son is currently hiding in his sock." The double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a heavy thud that sounded like a vault sealing shut. Every head turned. In a federal courtroom, people usually look expecting to see a lawyer running late or a witness looking terrified. They do not expect to see a king. I walked through the frame not with the shuffle of the old man from South Chicago, but with the stride of a man who has spent 40 years walking through steel mills and boardrooms. I was not wearing the charcoal suit from the thrift store. I was wearing $5,000 of Italian wool cut by a tailor in London who only sees 3 clients a year. The fabric was midnight blue so dark it absorbed the light around me. My shirt was crisp white silk. My tie was a silver blade. On my wrist, the platinum watch caught the overhead fluorescent lights and threw them back with a cold, hard glare. I did not look at this floor. I looked straight ahead. I walked with the rhythm of a metronome, steady and unstoppable. The air in the room changed. It grew heavier. The bailiff who had been slouching by the door straightened his spine instinctively. He did not know who I was, but his lizard brain recognized power when it walked past him. I was not Zeke the gardener. I was not Zeke the burden. I was Ezekiel Freeman, the man who commanded a fleet of 5,000 trucks and ships that moved the world. I was the man who built an empire out of sweat and logistics. I carried a leather briefcase that cost more than the monthly rent on Tyrell's first apartment. I walked down the center aisle and the sound of my heels on the marble floor was the only noise in the room. Tyrell turned in his seat. His eyes widened until I thought they might split. He blinked rapidly, trying to process the visual data that his brain was rejecting. He saw his father, but the context was wrong. It was like seeing a lion walking down a grocery aisle. His arrogance, which had been shaken but not broken by the proceedings, suddenly turned into a frantic confusion. He stood up so fast his chair skidded backward with a screech that made the stenographer wince. He stepped into the aisle, blocking my path. He looked at my suit. He looked at my face. He laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound that bordered on hysteria. He asked me what I was doing here. He hissed at me to leave. He said, "Dad, you are confused." He said, "This is a federal court, not a church basement." He said I was going to get arrested for loitering. He looked at the judge and waved his hand dismissively. He said, "Your Honor, please forgive him." He said, "My father is senile." He said he wanders off. He said he thinks he is important, but he is just a retired janitor. He reached out to grab my arm to steer me toward the exit, just like Courtney had done at the party. He thought he could handle me. He thought I was frail. I did not stop walking. I did not flinch. When his hand reached for my lapel, I didn't even look at it. I simply kept moving with the momentum of a freight train. I walked right through his space. He had to stumble backward to avoid being trampled. He tripped over his own feet and fell against the wooden railing of the gallery. He looked up at me from the floor, his mouth agape, his face flushing with humiliation. I did not look down at him. He was beneath my notice. I walked past the defense table where Courtney was staring at me with her hand over her mouth, her eyes darting between my shoes and my face, trying to calculate the cost of my outfit. I walked past the witness stand. I approached the plaintiff's table. Harper stood up immediately. She did not look surprised. She looked vindicated. She pulled out the heavy oak chair at the head of the table. I sat down. I placed my briefcase on the table. I unlocked the brass latches with 2 sharp clicks that sounded like gunshots in the silent room. I adjusted my cuffs. I folded my hands on the table. Tyrell scrambled to his feet. He looked at the judge. He pointed at me. He shouted that this was a farce. He shouted that I had no business sitting there. He shouted that I was mentally incompetent and needed to be removed by security. Judge Sterling banged his gavel. He ordered the defendant to sit down and be silent or be held in contempt. Tyrell collapsed into his chair, breathing hard, his eyes fixed on me with a mixture of fear and fury. The judge turned his gaze to me. He looked over his spectacles. He studied my suit. He studied my demeanor. He saw the man who was not supposed to be there. He asked clearly for the record if I was the representative for the creditor ZF Capital. I leaned forward. I grasped the neck of the microphone. I pulled it closer. The feedback whined for a split second before settling into a low hum. I looked across the aisle. I looked directly into the eyes of my son. I saw the moment the realization hit him. I saw the moment the bottom fell out of his world. I did not blink. I spoke with the voice that had negotiated mergers and broken strikes. My voice was deep, resonant, and absolutely cold. I said, "Good morning, Your Honor. There appears to be a significant misunderstanding regarding the identity of the plaintiff. The defendant knows me only as a retired laborer. He knows me as a man with no assets. He knows me as a beggar he threw water on in the snow. But that is not who I am. My name is Ezekiel Freeman. I am the founder and chairman of ZF Capital. I am the owner of the mortgage on 421 Maple Drive, and I am the creditor who has come to collect the debt from his own son." The silence that followed my declaration was not empty, it was heavy with the sudden crushing weight of reality. The air conditioner hummed, but no one breathed. Tyrell stood frozen in the aisle, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. He looked from my face to the judge, and back again, waiting for the punchline of a joke that was not coming. Harper stood up and placed a thick bound document on the judge's bench. It was not a mortgage deed. It was a consolidated financial statement audited by one of the Big Four accounting firms. Judge Sterling put on his reading glasses. He flipped the page. He stopped. He looked up at me over the rim of his spectacles, his eyebrows raising in genuine surprise. He read the number aloud for the record. $50 million in verified assets. The murmur that swept through the gallery was like a wave hitting the shore. Tyrell gripped the railing of the gallery box, his knuckles turning white. He looked at me with a hunger that was terrifying to behold. He did not see his father anymore. He saw a lottery ticket he had thrown in the trash. I stood up and buttoned my jacket. I looked at my son. I told the court about the Freeman optimization algorithm. I told them how 20 years ago I sat at the kitchen table night after night drawing diagrams on napkins trying to figure out how to make shipping containers move faster through bottleneck ports. I told them how a teenage Tyrell had laughed at me. I told them how he had called my work useless scribbles and told me I should get a real job like a manager at a retail store. I told them that those useless scribbles were now the industry standard for global logistics. I told them that every time a ship docked in Los Angeles or Rotterdam or Shanghai, my algorithm determined where the boxes went. I told them that the patent he mocked was currently generating royalties that paid for the building we were standing in. I saw the realization hit him. He had grown up in the shadow of a giant and had mistaken it for darkness. He had spent his life chasing the illusion of wealth from a con man while the real empire was being built in the room next door. I nodded to Harper. She tapped a key on her laptop. The large screens mounted on the walls of the courtroom flickered to life. The video was grainy at first, the night vision camera struggling with the low light and the driving snow. But the audio was crystal clear. The sound of the wind howling through the microphone filled the room, making the jurors pull their coats tighter. Then came the voice. My voice. Hoarse and desperate. I was begging my son to listen. I was warning him about the FBI. I was trying to save him. Then the camera angle shifted. It showed the second-floor balcony of the house on Maple Drive. It showed Tyrell stepping out in his silk robe. The contrast between the warm light spilling from the bedroom and the freezing darkness outside was stark. The court watched in horrified silence as my son lifted the heavy plastic bucket. They watched him heave the water over the railing. They heard the splash. They saw me stagger back, the ice water soaking my coat instantly. They heard Tyrell's laughter. They heard him tell me to wash away the jealousy. They heard him tell me to freeze. The video ended with the sound of the window slamming shut, leaving an old man shivering alone in the dark. The screen went black. I looked at the jury. Their faces were twisted in disgust. One juror, a middle-aged woman, was glaring at Tyrell with pure hatred. Judge Sterling looked down at the defendant. His expression was no longer neutral. It was the look of a man who wanted to jump over the bench. Tyrell shrank in his seat. He tried to make himself small. He tried to hide from the undeniable proof of his own cruelty. There was no defense for this. There was no spin. He was not a victim. He was a monster. Courtney stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. She was trembling violently, her face a mask of panic and calculation. She looked at the judge and then she looked at me. She burst into tears, but they were the dry, heaving sobs of someone who has been caught, not someone who is sorry. She stammered. She pointed a shaking finger at Tyrell and then at me. She said, "Dad, we did not know." She said, "You never told us." She said, "If we had known you had money, we never would have worried so much." She said, "We only wanted what was best for you." She said, "We were trying to protect you because we thought you were vulnerable." She said, "Everything we did was out of love and concern for your well-being." She looked at me with pleading eyes, begging me to accept the lie one last time. She wanted me to be the benevolent patriarch who smoothed everything over with a check. I looked at her. I let a small, cold smile touch my lips. I leaned into the microphone. My voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of the room. I asked her if poisoning me was her idea of protection. I asked her if the sedative she slipped into my water at the diner was an act of love. I asked her if she thought a chemical lobotomy was the best way to show concern for my well-being. Tyrell collapsed. It was not a graceful fall. It was the heavy thud of a man whose skeleton had simply turned to dust under the weight of the truth. He hit the knees of his thrift store suit against the hard courtroom floor, and the sound echoed like a gavel strike. He did not care about the judge. He did not care about the jury. He crawled toward the plaintiff's table. He reached out with shaking hands and grabbed the hem of my $5,000 trousers. He buried his face in the fabric and began to sob. It was a wet, ugly sound. He begged me. He called me Dad. He said he was sorry over and over again until the words lost their meaning and became just noise. He said it was all Bishop. He said Bishop had brainwashed him. He said Bishop had promised him the world and twisted his mind against me. He claimed he was a victim. He claimed he was just a confused young man who had been led astray by a master manipulator. He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears and snot, and he swore on his mother's grave that he never wanted to hurt me. He said he loved me. He said he only wanted to make me proud by becoming successful. He said he thought Bishop was the way to do that. He clung to my leg like a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. The courtroom watched in stunned silence. It was pathetic. It was humiliating. But I did not feel pity. I looked down at the top of his head and I felt nothing but a cold, hollow distance. I stepped back, pulling my leg away from his grasp. I smoothed the fabric of my pants. I did not offer him a hand up. I did not offer him a tissue. I let him stay on the floor where he had put himself. I looked at the judge who was watching the scene with an expression of deep distaste. Then I looked back at my son. I waited until his sobbing quieted down to a whimper. I waited until he looked up at me with those red-rimmed eyes, hoping to see the soft forgiveness of the father he used to know. But that father was gone. That father had frozen to death on his front porch 3 months ago. I spoke clearly so that the court reporter would catch every syllable. I asked him a question. I asked him if he would be kneeling on this floor right now if I had walked in here wearing my old coat. I asked him if he would be crying and begging for forgiveness if I was still just Zeke the gardener with no assets and a pension check. I watched the realization hit him. I watched his eyes dart away. I pressed him. I demanded an answer. I asked him if he would have shown me this mercy if his plan had worked. I asked him if he would be holding my hand and calling me Dad while he signed the papers to commit me to a state facility in Gary, Indiana. I told the court exactly what that facility was. I described the smell of bleach and urine. I described the restraints. I described the isolation. I told them that was the retirement plan my son had designed for me. I told them he was not crying because he was sorry. I told them he was crying because he realized that the man he tried to throw away was the only man who could save him, and that man was no longer interested in the job. Tyrell tried to speak, but he choked on his words. He knew I was right. He knew that if I were poor, he would be stepping over my body to get to the door. He knew that his remorse was directly tied to my net worth. I turned to the judge. I said, "Your Honor, this man claims he was manipulated. He claims he was a passive victim of a con artist. He claims he loves me. But love does not try to chemically lobotomize its object. Love does not steal, and love certainly does not commit felonies to expedite an inheritance." Courtney let out a small gasp from the defense table. She knew where I was going. She tried to signal Tyrell to shut up, to stop looking at me, but it was too late. I nodded to Harper. She opened her briefcase. She pulled out a single document enclosed in a clear plastic evidence bag. It was not a bank statement. It was not a deed. It was a copy of the life insurance policy Courtney had found in the car, the one they thought would solve all their problems. I held it up. I walked over to the witness stand where the clerk accepted it and handed it to the judge. I told the court to look at the bottom of the page. I told them to look at the request for a change of beneficiary and the request for an accelerated payout due to terminal illness. There was a signature at the bottom. It read, Ezekiel Freeman. The ink was black. The loops were wide. I looked at Tyrell, who was still on his knees. I told him to look at me. I told him that I had not signed anything in black ink in 20 years. I told him I only sign in blue archival ink. It is a habit from the shipping business. I told the judge that the signature on that document was a forgery. I told him that my son had tried to cash in my life before I was even dead. I told him that Tyrell had submitted this paperwork to the insurance company 2 days after I disappeared. He had claimed I was missing and presumed dead or incompetent, hoping to trigger a clause that would give him control of the policy. He wanted the $100,000 to run away. He wanted to use my death benefit to start a new life while I was still breathing. I leaned down close to Tyrell's face. I whispered so only he could hear, but the microphone picked it up anyway. I said, "You tried to sell my life, Tyrell. You tried to forge my death warrant." I stood up straight and addressed the bench. I said, "Your Honor, this is no longer a matter of bankruptcy or civil debt. This is fraud. This is forgery. This is an attempt to defraud an insurance carrier and steal the identity of a living person." I pointed at the document. I said my son did not just make bad financial decisions. He made criminal ones. He crossed the line from a bad borrower to a felon. The judge looked at the document. He compared the signature to the ones on the bankruptcy filing. His face went hard as stone. He looked at the bailiff standing by the door. He nodded. Tyrell saw the look. He tried to stand up, but his legs failed him. He slumped back against the plaintiff's table. He looked at his hands. He realized the walls were not just closing in. They had just locked. He realized that he had not just lost a lawsuit, he had lost his freedom. The civil trial was effectively over. The criminal trial was about to begin, and the primary witness against him was the man whose name he had signed. The judge ordered a recess to process the new evidence of forgery and fraud. The marshals moved to take Tyrell into custody, but I raised a hand. I asked the court for a moment. I walked to the large window on the left side of the courtroom, which overlooked the employee parking lot and the rear exit. I gestured for the bailiff to bring Tyrell to the window. The young man looked confused, but the authority in my voice made him comply. He dragged my weeping son over to the glass. I told Tyrell to look down. I pointed to a rusted gray sedan parked between a dumpster and a delivery truck. It was a car that had seen better days, the kind of vehicle you buy with cash and abandon without a second thought. Inside the driver's seat sat a figure hunched low, wearing a hooded sweatshirt and dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky. It was Bishop King. He was not in Dubai, he was not in Mexico. He was right here in the parking lot of the federal courthouse, hiding like a rat. He was a fugitive on the FBI's most wanted list for financial crimes, yet he had risked everything to come here. He was not here to support Tyrell. He was not here to provide legal counsel. He was here because he was an addict. He was addicted to other people's money, and he was desperate. He was waiting to see if Tyrell walked out of those doors. He was gambling that my son had managed to pull off one last con. He hoped that Tyrell had guilted me into a settlement or secured a loan modification or maybe even successfully forged a check. Bishop was waiting to strip the carcass of my son one last time before he fled the state. He was waiting to take whatever scraps Tyrell had managed to steal from me and leave him holding the bag. Tyrell squinted through his tears. He recognized the profile. He recognized the nervous tapping on the steering wheel. He whispered the name, Bishop. He looked at me with confusion. He asked why Bishop was here. He asked if Bishop had come to save him. I looked at my son with pity and disgust. I told him that Bishop was not a savior. I told him Bishop was a vulture. I told him that Bishop was only here because he thought you were stupid enough to get money out of me and loyal enough to hand it over to him. Then I pulled out my phone. I dialed a number I had saved as Agent Miller. I said 3 words into the receiver. "He is there." I hung up. Tyrell looked at me. He asked what I had done. I told him I had done what a father does. I cleaned up the mess. I told him that my private security team had tracked Bishop's burner phone for 3 days. I told him I knew exactly where he was sleeping and what he was eating. I told him I could have had him arrested yesterday. I could have had him picked up at a gas station on the interstate. But I didn't. I waited. I waited because I needed you to see this, Tyrell. I needed you to see the end of the movie you have been living in. Before Tyrell could answer, the parking lot below erupted. 4 unmarked black SUVs screeched around the corners, blocking the exits. Sirens wailed, slicing through the quiet afternoon. Men in tactical gear poured out of the vehicles, weapons drawn. They swarmed the gray sedan. Bishop scrambled. We watched from the window as the man who claimed to be a tycoon tried to claw his way out of the passenger door. He fell onto the asphalt. He tried to run, but he was an old man with soft hands and no stamina. An agent tackled him. They pressed his face into the grit of the parking lot. We watched as they stripped the sunglasses off his face. We watched as they tied his hands behind his back. We watched them pull a bag from the trunk of his car, a bag that likely contained the last of the money he had stolen from families just like ours. Tyrell watched in silence. His body was shaking. He was watching his god fall. He was watching the man he had put above me get treated like common street trash. The marshals in the courtroom received a signal. They opened the side doors to lead Tyrell down to the transport van. I followed them. I wanted to be there on the pavement. I wanted to hear what Bishop had to say. We walked out the side exit just as the agents were hauling Bishop toward their vehicle. He looked wild. His hair was a mess. His clothes were dirty. He looked up and saw us standing on the steps. He saw me in my bespoke suit looking down at him, and he saw Tyrell in handcuffs looking broken and small. The recognition on Bishop's face turned instantly to a feral rage. He did not look at me. He looked at Tyrell. He did not ask if Tyrell was okay. He lunged against the agents, spitting fury. He screamed at my son. His voice was a raw tear in the air. "You stupid fool, Tyrell," he yelled. "You useless idiot." Tyrell flinched as if he had been struck. He looked at Bishop with wide, pleading eyes. He whispered, "Pop." Bishop roared, "Do not call me that. You ruined everything. If you had just gotten the money from the old man like I told you, I would be halfway to the border by now. You were supposed to be my payday, Tyrell. You were supposed to be the golden goose. But you are just a failure. You could not even rob a senile old man properly." He thrashed in the grip of the agents. "I spent 2 years grooming you," Bishop screamed. 2 years listening to you whine about your daddy issues. And for what? For nothing. You are worthless, Tyrell. You are a bad investment. I should have left you in the gutter where you belong." The agent shoved Bishop into the back of the van and slammed the door, cutting off his stream of abuse. But the echo of his words hung in the cold air. Tyrell stood on the sidewalk. His knees buckled. The marshals had to grab his arms to keep him from hitting the ground. He looked at the van driving away. Then he looked at me. The realization washed over him. It was absolute. It was total. He had betrayed the father who loved him for a predator who viewed him as a line item on a balance sheet. He had tried to kill me for a man who wished he was dead. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He just crumbled. He hung his head and let out a sound that was not quite a cry and not quite a scream. It was the sound of a soul breaking into pieces. I watched him. I did not look away. I did not offer comfort. I simply adjusted my cufflinks and turned back toward my car. The lesson was delivered. The tuition had been paid in full. The sound of the gavel hitting the wood block was final, like the last nail being driven into a coffin. Judge Sterling did not mince words. He looked down at Tyrell and Courtney with the kind of disdain usually reserved for violent criminals. He declared their bankruptcy petition denied with prejudice, which meant they could never file again for these specific debts. The shield of the law had been stripped away, leaving them naked before their creditors. And the only creditor that mattered was me. The judge ordered the immediate seizure of all collateral. The house on Maple Drive was forfeit. The leased vehicles were to be surrendered immediately. But the judge did not stop at civil penalties. He looked at the evidence of the forged insurance documents and the concealed assets. He stated clearly that he was referring the matter to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. Tyrell and Courtney were no longer just homeless, they were facing potential prison time for fraud. The judge set a restitution plan that was essentially a life sentence of debt. Every dollar they earned for the rest of their lives would be garnished until ZF Capital was made whole. They would be working for me forever. I watched the color drain from Courtney's face as she realized her future did not hold vacations in the Hamptons but double shifts at a diner just to stay out of jail. Tyrell looked at me one last time, his eyes begging for a reprieve, for a fatherly intervention that would stop the bleeding. I simply closed my briefcase. The snap of the latches was the only answer he got. I stood up and walked out of the courtroom, leaving them to explain to the bailiffs why they had no address to give for their probation paperwork. I did not wait for the sun to go down. I wanted them to feel the shame in the harsh light of day. The sheriff's deputies arrived at the house on Maple Drive at 4 in the afternoon. It was raining, a cold, relentless Chicago sleet that turned the world gray and miserable. I parked the Rolls-Royce half a block away, the tinted windows turning the scene into a silent movie. I watched as the officers banged on the door. I watched as they gave my son and his wife 10 minutes to gather their essentials. There was no dignity in it. They came out stumbling. Courtney was dragging a large suitcase with a logo that pretended to be Louis Vuitton. As she hit the bottom step, the cheap plastic wheel snapped off. The case fell sideways into a puddle of mud. She stood there in the freezing rain, staring at her ruined bag and her ruined life. She looked up at the house that was no longer hers. The neighbors were watching. Curtains twitched in every window on the block. The people Courtney had tried so hard to impress were now witnessing her total collapse. Tyrell came out carrying a box of clothes and a lamp. He looked small. The arrogance was gone, washed away by the rain. The deputies locked the door and placed a bright orange eviction sticker over the lock. It was over. The kingdom of lies had officially been condemned. My driver Michael put the car in gear to pull away slowly. Tyrell saw the movement. He recognized the phantom grill. He dropped his box in the wet grass and ran toward the car. He looked like a drowned rat, his expensive suit soaked through his hair plastered to his skull. He pounded on the rear window. He shouted my name. He begged for a ride. He begged for just one night in a hotel. He said they had nowhere to go. He said they would freeze. I signaled Michael to stop. I lowered the window just 3 inches. The heat from the car's interior rushed out to meet the cold air hitting Tyrell in the face. He gripped the glass, his fingers white. He pleaded. He said, "Dad, please just help us get to the shelter." I looked at him. I reached down to the floorboard. I picked up an old black umbrella. It was broken. One of the metal spokes was snapped and poking through the fabric. It was the same umbrella Tyrell had given me 5 years ago when I visited him in the rain, and he refused to let me inside because he had guests. He had handed it to me through a crack in the door and told me to stay dry. I pushed the broken umbrella through the gap in the window. Tyrell took it instinctively. I looked him in the eye. I told him that walking is good for the health. I told him it builds character. I rolled the window up. As we drove away, I watched him in the rearview mirror standing in the middle of the road holding a broken umbrella over his head while the rain soaked him to the bone. 6 months is a lifetime when you are living hour by hour. I parked the Rolls-Royce 3 blocks away because I did not want to draw attention to the neighborhood. It was a working-class district on the edge of the city, the kind of place where the neon signs flickered and the pavement was cracked from years of neglect. I walked toward a diner called Sal's Place. It was a greasy spoon with fogged windows and a menu that hadn't changed since 1980. I walked in and the smell of frying onions and old coffee hit me instantly. It was the smell of honest desperation. I sat in a booth near the back where the vinyl was taped together with duct tape. I scanned the room. It took me a moment to find him. He was moving between the tables carrying a heavy plastic tub of dirty dishes. He was wearing a white apron that was stained with gravy and grease. He had lost at least 30 pounds. His expensive haircut had grown out into something shaggy and unkempt. His face was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp against his skin, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of double shifts and insomnia. This was Tyrell Freeman. The man who had rented a Bentley to impress a con artist was now clearing tables for minimum wage plus tips. I watched him work. I saw him get yelled at by a customer who wanted more ketchup. I saw him nod his head and apologize. I saw him run to the kitchen and come back breathless. The arrogance was gone. It had been burned out of him by the friction of survival. He looked exhausted. He looked broken. But for the first time in his life, he also looked real. He came to my table with a pitcher of water, not looking up, his eyes focused on the glasses. He poured the water. Then he looked up to ask for my order. He froze. The pitcher shook in his hand, splashing a little water onto the table. He stared at me. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked terrified. He thought I was there to mock him. He thought I was there to twist the knife. He looked at his dirty apron and then at my suit. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin throat. He didn't say a word. He just waited. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a greeting. I picked up the sticky laminated menu. I ordered a meatloaf sandwich and a black coffee. Tyrell wrote it down, his hand trembling so hard the pen could barely stay on the pad. He walked away to the kitchen. I watched him go. He didn't strut. He shuffled. He was tired. I ate my meal in silence, watching him work the room. He was efficient. He didn't stop to check his phone because he probably didn't have one anymore. He didn't stop to chat. He worked because if he didn't work, he didn't eat. When he brought me the check, he placed it face down on the table. He stood there for a second, shifting his weight from one tired foot to the other. He looked like he wanted to say something, but shame is a heavy gag. He turned to walk away. I opened the check folder. The bill was $12.50. I took out a $20 bill. I didn't pull out a stack of hundreds. I didn't leave a tip that would change his life. I left him $7.50. A standard tip. A fair tip. I stood up and put on my coat. Tyrell was clearing a table nearby. I walked over to him. He stopped wiping the table and stood up straight, clutching the rag like a shield. He couldn't meet my eyes. He looked at his shoes, the cheap, non-slip kind that hurt your arches. I stepped into his space. I waited until he forced himself to look at me. His eyes were red-rimmed and full of tears that he was fighting to hold back. I gestured to the table where I had eaten. I told him that the money on the table was his. I looked him hard in the face. I spoke low and clear so only he could hear. I told him that was the first time in his life I had ever seen him make clean money. I told him to keep it. I told him to hold on to it because he had earned it with his own hands, not with lies and not with theft. Tyrell broke. A single sob escaped his throat. He nodded his head, jerking it down as if he couldn't bear the weight of my gaze anymore. He whispered thank you. It was small and weak, but it was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. I didn't hug him. I didn't tell him it was going to be okay. I turned around and walked out of the diner, leaving my son to finish his shift. The sun was setting over Lake Michigan, painting the water in shades of violent orange and deep purple. I sat on the terrace of my villa, the wind carrying the scent of fresh water and pine. It was quiet here. Not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of peace. Inside, Harper was sitting at the dining table reviewing the quarterly reports for the Freeman Foundation. She looked up as I walked in. She told me the numbers were good. She said we had just approved our 100th scholarship recipient, a young man from the South Side who wanted to study logistics. His application essay talked about watching his father work 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. He had the hunger. He had the drive. He reminded me of myself 40 years ago, before the money, before the betrayal. Harper smiled. She said he was going to be a star. I nodded. I told her to approve the full ride. Tuition, books, housing, everything. I told her to make sure he never had to worry about money so he could focus on building his mind. I poured 2 glasses of iced tea and sat down opposite her. We didn't talk about business for a while. We talked about our grandchildren. We talked about the weather. We talked about the simple things that make a life worth living. I looked around the room. It was filled with photos not of my biological family, but of the family I had built. There were pictures of scholarship recipients holding their diplomas. There were pictures of my employees at company picnics. There were pictures of Harper and her husband at their anniversary party. These people were not bound to me by blood. They were bound to me by respect. They were bound to me by shared values. They called me Mr. Freeman not because they wanted my money, but because they valued my guidance. They were my legacy. I was not a lonely old man dying in a mansion. I was a patriarch of a community I had forged with my own hands. Later that night, after Harper had left, I went into my study. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside was a small silver frame. It held a photo of Tyrell when he was 5 years old. He was sitting on my shoulders, laughing, his hands gripping my hair tight. He looked so happy. He looked so innocent. I traced the line of his small face with my finger. I had loved that boy more than my own life. I had worked double shifts until my back broke just to buy him the sneakers he wanted. I had sacrificed my pride 1,000 times to give him a better start than I had. And in the end, it hadn't been enough. Or maybe it had been too much. Maybe I had shielded him so well from the struggle that he never learned how to fight. I looked at the photo for a long time. The pain was still there, a dull ache in the center of my chest. I had lost my son. Not to death, but to greed. I had lost him to the illusion of easy money and false idols. But as I looked at his smiling face, I realized something else. I had saved myself. I had refused to be a victim in my own life. I had refused to let them strip me of my dignity and leave me to rot. I put the photo back in the drawer and closed it. The click of the latch was soft but final. I walked out onto the terrace again. The stars were out now, bright and cold against the black sky. I took a deep breath of the night air. It tasted clean. It tasted like freedom. I had paid a high price for this peace, $50 million was a lot of money, but the cost of the truth was even higher. It cost me my family. It cost me my heart. But standing there looking out at the dark water, I knew it was a bargain. I had bought back my self-respect. I had bought back my future. And that was a truth worth every single penny. I turned off the lights and went inside, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. I learned that you cannot buy respect, but you can certainly buy your freedom. My son thought wealth was about flashing watches and driving leased cars, but real wealth is the ability to walk away from people who drain your soul, even if they share your blood. It took me 70 years to realize that I didn't need their validation. I needed my own self-respect. To anyone watching this who feels trapped by toxic family obligations or undervalued by those they sacrificed for, do not set yourself on fire just to keep others warm. Sometimes the most loving thing a father can do is let his children fall so they can finally learn how to stand on their own 2 feet. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more. Let me know in the comments below, would you have given Tyrell another chance, or did he get exactly what he deserved?